Daryl, we want to spend a little bit of time and talking about a crop that perhaps not many people in the state are aware of. You call them stubble beans. So give us a little bit of an education here. Stubble beans, what are they? How do they fit into a cropping rotation?
Well, I raise wheat. I'm only about 30 miles from the Kansas state line and 5 miles from Missouri. Our growing season is a little longer than a lot of the rest of the state. And so once we harvest the wheat, then I plant soybeans on that wheat ground. And then I quite often get a pretty good crop of soybeans. It depends, of course, on the weather. This year, right about wheat harvest time, we start getting some rains. I didn't get my stubble beans planted till into the 10th or 12th of July, so they won't yield quite as much. But if you get the wheat out, get the stubble beans in late June, you can get close to 50 bushels an acre on stubble beans. And when you add that to the income from the wheat and from the straw, you actually can make a little money on the ground.
Yeah, I was going to say, so this is basically a Daryl, you'd call this basically a double cropping opportunity, right?
Yes, it's a double crop. When I first started farming back in the 70s, I would put I would just put a cover crop following wheat and then pasture it or put it up for hay. But I started playing around in the 90s when the price of beans got a little bit attractive. I started putting part of the wheat ground to soybeans, and I found out that I can make more money on soybeans than I could on the hay crop off of the ground. So, even this year with not getting them in till almost mid-July, I just started on them yesterday evening, but they well could be into the 40s, and with $10 beans, that's just an added income on ground that otherwise would either sit idle or maybe used for pasture. But it's a good source of income.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you two questions about this. First of all, how does it work out agronomically having these three crops in 2 years? Do you have to do anything special agronomically to make this happen?
Well, you just want to make sure that you don't use a herbicide, because it's pretty short turnaround from when you plant the beans to when you put the crop the next year. You want to make sure not to use a herbicide that can carry over to the following crop. And then what I usually do too is I use a shorter season wheat, and you can get a fuller season wheat and then harvest is 2 or 3 weeks later. But I usually get a shorter season wheat, and that allows for me to get it out, unless you get bogged down by rain, get it out in late June, get the beans planted yet in late June. And, when that happens, you're pretty well, unless you have a terrible drought, you're pretty well guaranteed beans into the 40s as far as yield.
Okay. And then on the other side, profitability. Does it make sense money-wise to do these three crops in 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Because for one thing I've noticed, and this is a soybean program, but I've noticed that whatever crop follows wheat, whether it's corn or soybeans, you get about a 5% yield bump. And I suppose it's just because you break that monoculture that we've kind of developed in this area, and it just brings a third crop into it. It's better for soil health, and so it helps the subsequent crop having wheat. And then, straw is such a shortage anymore. Wheat used to be a dominant crop around here, and there's so little wheat anymore that straw has become a pretty good item to have for sale. So it just all around, it makes a lot more work, but it produces quite a bit of income.
Yeah. All right. So stubble beans, a double cropping opportunity that you've been utilizing here. Sounds great. I guess, if we've piqued anybody's interest in this idea of a double cropping situation, I guess, do you have any advice? How do you get started? What are kind of the keys for you that make it work?
Yeah. One thing I should have mentioned, you need to plant the stubble beans a little bit thicker than than the conventional planted bean because they pod closer to the ground if they don't come up until after the longest day of the year. With beans being kind of determined by the day length. So what I do is, and it takes a little more work. On my regular soybeans, I plant about 110,000. And on stubble beans, I leave the planter set there, but I plant it two different directions. So I'm putting about 200,000, and I have, anywhere from, 20 to 90 degree angle to the original rows. And I've tried it just planting 200,000 in 15-inch rows and 100,000 twice in this crisscross. And there's a yield bump of about 10 bushels an acre with the double planting.
Yeah, probably has to do with having roots growing in a larger area of the ground instead of just rows. You're utilizing that space in between the rows too, huh?
Right, and a little bit better at marketing the sunshine because the ground is covered so much quicker where you have rows in two different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, great. Very interesting conversation. Well, I appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much. Again, we've been visiting with Daryl Obermeyer. He is from Brownville, Nebraska, District 6 Director of the Nebraska Soybean Association. If you believe, belong. If you'd like more information on any of the things we've hit on today, call the home office in Lincoln at 402-441-3239. That's this week's report, a service of the Nebraska Soybean Association. Chad Moyer reporting.